Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia. Let's talk books, and today I'm here to talk about my favorite books of 2020 in the nonfiction category, not history in parentheses. The last video that I posted was of my favorite history books in 2020. So these are all the other nonfiction books that I read. There are 7 in this category, and I'm gonna go in order of kind of the bottom of this list all the way to my favorite book in the nonfiction category for 2020. So let's get right to it. The first book in this category is the only one that I own in physical copy, and that is Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay. So this is a series of essays, and I did buddy read this with Shannon over at That's So Poet. That was such a great experience. Thank you, Shannon, for reading this with me. But it's a collection of essays that each have to do with rape culture in the United States, dealing with different aspects of it, all from different perspectives. And I loved reading this book, even though it's a difficult topic, because it just highlights how prevalent toxic ideas about sex, about sexuality, exist in our society, and it really, pushed me to really try to fight these more in my thoughts, in the things that I read, and in the media that I consume. It's really difficult to escape rape culture in this country, and I appreciated very much the reminder that this book provided for me of it's a constant battle. This is something that we constantly have to be fighting. Otherwise, our lives get affected. We end up with terrible sexual experiences because we've been influenced by this kind of culture that says that certain things are okay, that should not be okay. And fortunately, there's been a push, thanks to the Me Too movement and such, to at least name and expose this type of rape culture that exists in our country. And there's so much work still left to be done, but I really enjoyed these essays, some a little bit more than others, but overall these were really strong essays and a strong collection. The next book in my list of favorite nonfiction books of 2020 was Heave, an American memoir by Kiese, Layman. The title tells you everything, and it's heavy in multiple areas, in that the material that Layman talks about in this book is heavy, and it also has to do with weight. A lot of it has to do with being an overweight young man and an overweight man in the U.S. It has to do with his relationship with his mother, with his grandmother. His mother was an academic, but she had very particular ideas of what she wanted for her son. And he sometimes met those expectations, and other times did not. His mother also had some addiction problems, and that ended up really affecting him in very profound ways. He ends up becoming an academic, teaching at a university. Those were the things that I really connected with, because he talks about the racism in the academy and how it shows up in small and in big ways, and I just completely related to all of that. He also talks about generational poverty and how you can have someone who's a professor and still barely be making ends meet, or not be making ends meet, and how that creates difficulty for the whole family. It's one of those really powerful books, and I think that more people should read it. I first heard about this book through my sister. She actually read it and really recommended it to me, and then Didi over at Brown Go Reading read and reviewed this book and convinced me that I needed to pick it up sooner rather than later, and I do not regret that at all. It was really one of my favorite memoirs that I read in 2020. The next book on the list is also a memoir, and I actually read these two back to back, which was a fantastic experience. The next book is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. And it turns out Johnson and I were born in the same year, and so as they talk about all of the pop culture moments and all the political moments that impacted their life, I was able to relate a lot to it. except Johnson had a very different experience than I. They grew up in a very tight-knit family. Clearly, a lot of love existed in that family. Johnson especially talks a lot about the relationship that they had with their grandmother. And their grandmother seems to have had just such a profound and loving impact on the entire family, but especially on Johnson. And Johnson also talks about some difficult topics in here about, difficult sexual experiences, about trying to come to terms with their queerness and the queerness of family members, and how that impacted, their life, their relationships. It was super impactful. The parts that especially got to me were when they talk about going to college, and how being in the closet really affected how they interacted, especially with their family, because the moment of going off to college is important in that you're kind of separated from your family. And so that allows some amount of experimentation that would not have been okay, with the family, but can now occur. And yet when you have a close relationship with your family, you keep going back to them and they don't disappear. And so there's a conflict, and there's a feeling of like living a double life that I thought was really profound. And it's also, this is a young adult memoir. So, but I felt that this will really speak to those of us in that generation, and others as well, but especially those of us who lived through the same cultural historical moment, because it really highlights how we all have such different experiences depending on our different situations. But I really, really, really loved All Boys Aren't Blue. Yeah. The next book on my list is The Devil's Highway, a true story by Alberto Urrea. I first heard about this book following the controversy around American Dirt, which, if you haven't heard, is a book that you should stay away from. People that I really trust have talked about how it really plays to a lot of stereotypes about immigrants, especially Mexican immigrants, and it's something that I don't have any need to read at this point in my life, but instead people were recommending Alberto Urrea as someone to read. And so I picked up The Devil's Highway, which talks about the trip that a lot of immigrants make through the Arizona desert. It's an overlap. It's not just one state, but specifically through that desert, and it focuses on the story of a particular group of immigrants, that many of whom died in the desert. So this was in the 80s, I believe. This was some time ago, but Urrea really goes into detail about what that experience of immigrating from Mexico to the U.S. through that desert is, and how desperate people are that they're willing to risk their life crossing in the summer months through one of the most dangerous deserts in the world. And it was so impactful. Lots of trigger warnings in this book too, because he goes into detail on how do you die of dehydration. I had to skim some of those parts because I just could not handle it. And as an immigrant myself, I have a really hard time reading immigrant stories because I just relate to it so much, even when it's not exactly my same story. I see my family, my parents, my uncles, my aunts, my neighbors in immigrant stories that I read, and it becomes very difficult for me. It's just a very emotional experience. And so The Devil's Highway was a really emotional read for me, but it's one that I think is very worthwhile. The next book on my list is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. So you have probably heard the story of Chanel Miller, even if you don't recognize her name, because she was assaulted by Brock Turner, and his name ended up being all over the media because he assaulted Miller behind a trash can during a party, and she was rescued by a couple of other students, and then the outrage it provoked, because he got a very lenient sentence. Brock Turner got a very lenient sentence, and a line that kept coming up was something his dad uttered during the trial, which was like, he's getting punished for like 15 seconds of like action. That's what he said. Just really outrageous. So this book really actually connected a lot to the collection Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay, about rape culture. But this story is completely told by Miller, because that is one of the voices that was left out of the discussion of the assault that Brock Turner did. She was protected during the trial, and her name was not released at the time, and this book was her coming out and telling her version of the story, now that the trial has been over. And I was just so moved by everything she said, the way she described everything, and how, we have a lot of work to do in the way we treat victims of sexual assault, and the way we discuss them, the way we discuss perpetrators and their families, the way the justice system treats them, is just, it's a harrowing experience for anybody that has to go through that. And I was very moved by the book, and I highly recommend it. It seriously is just, it's such a well-written book with an incredible and very touching story. The next book, this is the second favorite book, my second favorite nonfiction book of 2020, was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. In the Dream House. Wow. How do I talk about this book? It's actually really short, but it's really heavy. Lots of trigger warnings. I think there's trigger warnings for every single book on this list, but this one specifically deals with domestic abuse in a queer female-female relationship. Machado talks about how her experience being in this long-term romantic relationship with another woman, and the way in which she was manipulated and emotionally abused by this woman, and how hard it was to even understand that experience as abuse because it was a queer relationship. There's very little data and research on domestic abuse within queer relationships, and there's a lot of pressure within the queer community to have like kind of happy relationships at a time in which gay people were fighting for marriage equality. And Machado just has a great narrative style, and this is something that is not going to work for everybody, by the way. I realize that Machado's narrative style will not work, and because every chapter is framed as like a chapter of In the Dream House, right? This was a dream house, dream relationship from the outside, and then she's delving in, she's digging into some aspect of the relationship in each chapter. For me, the narrative style just worked beautifully, and I would urge you to look at other reviews if you're interested in this book, just people that can talk a little bit more specifically about what the narrative style is. I know that Priscilla over at Bookie Charm did a really wonderful review of this book that I'll link down below, so you go check it out if you're interested in this book. This was just worked so fabulously for me that like I keep thinking about this book every so often, because it was just so incredible. Really enjoyed it. And then my favorite nonfiction book of 2020, and I think this might actually be my favorite book of 2020, if I'm being really honest, because it is a haunting book that has stayed with me. Okay, it's been a year now. I read it in January, I believe, of 2020, and it's now January of 2021, and I still think about this book sometimes. The book is Midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster by Higginbotham. Okay, so very clearly, like if you if you've heard the word Chernobyl, then you've heard it in relationship to this nuclear disaster, this nuclear reactor in a what is now former Soviet Union satellite. Had an explosion, and the environmental results of this explosion and the fumes that went into the air and into the ground in what is now Ukraine continue to impact us. They still don't really have it figured out, but they've been able to contain the disaster, but they haven't fixed it. Like, all the fallout from this disaster still exists. It's just been contained. And so the book takes you like minute by minute on how this disaster occurred, going back to how nuclear power functioned within the Soviet Union, and how the dysfunctional politics of the Soviet Union contributed to really shoddy work in the construction of this nuclear reactor and then in the maintaining of it. It takes you through different points of view, different people impacted by it, people that worked at the nuclear facility, politicians, people that worked in that town. And it's so haunting because it's a story that begins much earlier, right? Because the story begins, with Soviet politics. And then each chapter, you know what's going to happen, right? You know that there's going to be an explosion, that this is the worst nuclear disaster in human history. And as you're going through it, there's that expectation. When is it coming? When is it coming? And so it creates this tension while reading it, this anxiety. I physically became anxious while reading this book. And you'd think that would make this book not a good one to read, but the fact that it was able to evoke such strong physical reactions from me, like, that's unique. And for me, it made it. It spoke to how well written this book is. It's also, in terms of the history, really well done. I'm not an expert on this topic, so I can't vouch for everything. And apparently some of the scientific details here and there might be just a little bit off and things like that. But the historians who work on this actually recommend this book. It is a work of popular fiction, so it was written for a wider audience. It was not written for experts, and so it's incredibly accessible, incredibly readable. After reading this book, I also watched the HBO miniseries. So they did like a miniseries of it, and it was clear to me that they used this book as a source because it matched up. The miniseries matched up really well with the story. There were some key differences because the miniseries took a few liberties with the story, and also there are some discrepancies in terms of the first-hand accounts of what happened, but I highly recommend both the miniseries and the book. Very difficult topic, but if you are all interested, it is very worthwhile. So those are my favorite works of nonfiction that I read in 2020. Let me know if you've read any of them. Clearly, I like reading really heavy topics. Part of it has to do with the fact that as an academic, I work on really heavy topics. So I guess even though I don't like reading super heavy books, they are the ones that end up having a huge impact on me, the ones that I end up remembering a lot, that end up becoming favorites at the end of the year. So I don't know what to say about that, other than I guess this is a thing for me, and I've accepted it. I balance it out. I balance out all the super heavy stuff with, like, lighter romance. So my next video is going to be talking about romance novels to balance out all the super heavy nonfiction here. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.